thank you all for coming here and sharing with us and sharing with each other our experiences with Bruce. That's what we have to remember him by, and we always will.
There was Bruce Seymour, who had been in the U.S. Air Force, and his boss from the U.S. Air Force is here. So you can imagine somebody having to supervise Abu in the military context. He may give us some details of that later on. There was an individual named Bruce Palmer who had been in the U.S. Navy, and then I had been in the Navy. So the three of us were a little bit older than most of the people starting law school. And we became great friends. And so I got to know Abu very well at that point. But I knew him not because he was in school, because he never was in school. He never went to class. He would go maybe once a week maximum. And there would be his 1 hour lectures, and he'd sit in the back, never taking notes. And for whatever reason, he was fixated that year on drawing the flags of the various countries of the world. So at the end of a class, he'd have elaborate drawings of flags from 3 countries. And that was kind of what he did. Then I also got to know Uncle Bruce's incredibly weird dietary habits, which you can see over here. And those who know him will know this well. So one instance, just to give a small one, I'll give more later on if anybody wants. He would go down to the Wonder Bread factory in San Francisco. There was a Wonder Bread factory down by the old Seal Stadium. And Wonder Bread, besides making Wonder Bread, would make ding-dongs, if everybody's acquainted with ding-dongs. And the machinery would be defective, make incorrect ding-dongs periodically. And they couldn't sell those to the markets. So what they do is compile them in these big bags of defective ding-dongs. And Abu would go and buy the bags of defective ding-dongs and basically live on them for substantial periods of time. So it was always interesting. So that was the first year, 73, 74. The second year of my law school career, I went to class and I actually enrolled. Abu dropped out for the year and traveled all over South America for a year. And then he came back the next year. So that was 75, 76. And that was my last year. I went through class and did the regular thing. Abu didn't go to class. He re-enrolled in class, but he never went to any classes. He only went to the finals. So what I would do is, at his request, is I'd find out when his finals were, which was fine. This was pre-internet, so you'd have to go to the postings that were on there. And so I'd get the posting and let him know when the finals were. And that worked out fine, except for one of the classes had half was a take-home final. And he didn't know about it. So he didn't hand that in. But it all turned out okay. I mean, he did well. He did well first year, second year.
Don't forget, he was working full-time at the Veterans Administration.
Right, he was working 40 hours a week at the VA. So even if he kind of wanted to go to class, which he didn't, he was going to have a tough time doing it. So then, the next year, I graduated and took the bar and all that, and he came back for his third year, and he did the same thing, worked 40 hours a week at the VA, only came for the finals. I wasn't around to tell him when the finals were, but he seemed to figure it out, and at least he got through. So then he graduated and passed the bar, and because he wanted to make sure he didn't work, he went and got a fellowship for international trade law, which meant that and people are here who were who knew him there.
He did nothing there either.
Yeah. So that was, I think, it's supposedly a year.
2.
2 years,
Yeah.
okay. Well, he did nothing for those 2 years, not just one. So he was there for 2 years, met the number of people who became great friends of, including Mary, and also Clarissa Bondi, aka the Countess, if you're acquainted with the Countess. And then he went off to Germany for the second part of the fellowship, and he was at Bielefeld, in the University of Bielefeld, which I'm sure he never showed up for class there either. But he had, and among other things, he traveled around much of Germany and much of Europe. And he got major friends there, including Anna.
Right here.
Yeah, and Anna, among others. And then after doing that, he graduated And then he kept traveling around Europe and Germany for a long period of time until he came back and decided to practice law for his career. And he practiced with Jim
Yes, for a
and
while.
Joel Lynn. Yeah. So I was going to mention
He
it.
was always there.
Oh, there's Joel. So
Yeah, Joel was a law clerk.
Right.
Who kept Bruce in line.
yeah,
Go for charity things.
yeah. Well, if you could keep him in line, you're way above, better than us. So at that point, he did that for a while. We're talking months rather than, decades. And then he decided he needed to tour the U.S. So he bought an old clunker car and drove around the U.S. Hitting such garden spots as all the graves of the presidents.
Yeah.
At that point, Ellen and I lived in San Mateo. I worked in San Francisco, and Ellen worked at Berkeley. And we had a 1-year-old child, Brian. And so it was a difficult situation having to commute and all that kind of stuff. So what we decided is we needed to buy a house in the East Bay. So after multiple machinations, we ended up entering into a contract to purchase this house, and we entered into a contract to sell our house in San Mateo. And the way those contracts work is there was an overlap. So for 1 month, we were still living in San Mateo. We hadn't sold that house. It hadn't closed. And we were living, owned Piedmont. We weren't living there. So I talked to Doug Boo and I said, okay, there's a month overlap. You want to kind of house sit for a month? And he said, yes. And that was 25 years. So 1 month turned into 25 years. And what we did then is he moved into the basement here. And he lived in the basement. He was known throughout as the troll in the basement with his 8,000 books. And he worked out well generally with the neighbors once they realized that the screeching they heard from here was not women being abused, but Ugbo cranking up his stereo with his opera. And he would just crank that up, and we kind of got him to tone it down. So that was the beginning of the 25 years. So part of that, he traveled. And basically, he'd be here, we were at, his home base. And he probably traveled maybe a third of the time, and 2/3 of the time he lived here. So various things he did when he was here. He did handyman work. He loved to do handyman work, projects, if we call them. And he helped take care of the kids. So at that point, we had both Brian, who was started at 1, and Emily, who came along later, 3 years later. And everybody knew that Ugbo was going to help out with the kids. So he would have an incredibly erratic sleep schedule. So he'd sleep partially during the day and then stay up all night, which worked out fine for us because then the kids knew if they needed anything in the middle of the night, they just called Ugbo. So Ugbo was the one who took care of these things. Brian and Emily got tutored by Ugbo, and especially as a Brian, that extended for a long period of time. That was K through 12, so that was 13 years there. He also tutored when he was at Berkeley, UC Berkeley, and then he tutored him when he was in law school. So one of the pictures there you'll see with Ugbo with Brian at the graduation from UC Berkeley, but Ugbo helped all that time period. So that was really great.
It was K through law school. Yes.
K through law school, right.
Hey, Bruce, didn't Ugbo tutor Brian's kids?
Well, that's next. We're gonna get there. I'm trying to do it chronologically. Okay, so one of the things he would do is that he would be constantly traveling. And one of the things he got very fixated on Lola Montez, as you've probably heard. And so Lola was from 1821 to 1861. And she was kind of an actress, dancer, courtesian, fraudster, is basically what she was. And Ugbo got very interested in her when he was reading a biography of Franz Liszt, who was a famous composer who got involved with Lola. And there were a lot of rich and famous people who got involved with Lola over the years, all over the world. So it gave Ugbo an excuse to travel all over the world to do his research on Lola, which he did. And he continued doing his research even after he published the book on Lola. I mean, he was totally fixated on Lola. So some of the things that Ugbu did in our house when he was here is, I say, kids, help out with the handyman work. But he never did, and we made sure he never did, he didn't cook for us.
That's why you're here today.
Yeah. He had some of the weirdest, I mean, he just couldn't cook. And one approach is, well, did he have no taste buds? And I think it's just with Ugbu, if he wasn't interested in anything, he just didn't do it. I mean, he didn't care about sports. He didn't care about, athletics. He didn't care about food. He didn't care about clothing. It's just, those were things he didn't care about. And cooking was one of them. But the end result is there would be strange machinations of what he would make. So one of the things, just for an example, is salad. He'd make a salad every once in a while. We'd let him. And what he'd do is he'd use the pickle juice. You can see the pickle juice over there? That would be the salad dressing. So that was Ugbu's idea of great meal, was lettuce with pickle juice. So he participated in Jeopardy basically in 2 phases. So there was the first year, let's just call it, where he was on the regular Jeopardy show. And back then it worked where 3 contestants every day. The one who won was the one who got the highest score that day. And then if you kept going on until you defeated, if you got 5 games and won 5 games, then you were automatically in a championship at the end of the year called the Tournament of Champions. So he did 5 programs. He won 4 out of the 5. The 5th one he didn't win. It's a long story. But what happened is, because he had such a high score when he participated in the regular Jeopardy, they had him come back at the end of the year for the Tournament of Champions. So he participated in the Tournament of Champions at the end of the year, did fine, but didn't win, and moved on theoretically. Well, in 1990, the producers of Jeopardy decided they wanted to have a show called Super Jeopardy, which is where they're going to bring back the top contestants of all times and play off against each other for a prize of $250,000. So although he hadn't won the Tournament of Champions and he hadn't won 5 games, he still had one of the highest scores of all times. So they invited him back, and he participated in Super Jeopardy and won. So he won $250,000.
They're telling me 36 people in that
Right.
Super Jeopardy.
Right. And, they weeded him out just like they did in weed. And so at that point, and you can see the poster over there, he was the top Jeopardy winner of all times, between the 250 and what he'd won during the regular season. So he retired as the top Jeopardy winner of all times. He just traveled differently than most people. And so what he would do frequently is he would rent an Airbnb in a major city like London or Paris or St. Petersburg or Tokyo. And he would go to the city, stay there for a month or longer, and go to museums 8 or more hours a day. I mean, he was just totally fixated on it, which meant he didn't have a lot of traveling partners because nobody wanted to live that life. But he was very serious about it, and he was very extensive about it. So then, lastly, toward the end of life, we'll get to there, he joined a book group. A number of people are here. So Chris Arnold, David Nelson, Bruce Kovach, who couldn't be here with me. And I think what it came down to is he was intimidated initially by the intellect of the existing members.
Nice try.
But effectively, I think what it was is he decided he was going to tutor old men as well as young kids. So what was the ongoing relationship with Ugbu after he moved into San Francisco? Because when he came back from Europe, he went into the Peace Corps for a while in Ukraine, which is, if you're well aware, is a country that's really under duress these days. And he lived in the city called Sumy, S-U-M-Y. And that's an area where Russian is the primary language. That's one of the things he wanted. And Sumy now is in the newspaper because the Russians are blowing the hell out of Sumy right now. It's really, really tragic. So after he was in the Peace Corps, they kind of ushered him out because he had some eye problems and Peace Corps didn't want him. He moved back to San Francisco and lived in an studio apartment in the Tenderloin. If people, I assume, know the Tenderloin, it's not the gorgeous part of San Francisco. But he liked it because it was cheap, which is kind of a boo. It was subject to rent control, and it was near to the Department of Health and Human Services, which is a government agency that handles Medicare. And he got a job with HHS, starting off as a paralegal, and then worked his way up to a lawyer. And Rob Perez is here.
There you are.
He was one who got to supervise Ugbo in that capacity, so I'm sure there's some stories there. But when he was there, then he would come over here to the Gilmore family, the continuing involvement with the Gilmore family. There's kind of two Gilmore components at that point. There's Ellen and me in Piedmont, and then there's Brian, Leslie, and their 5 children in Castro Valley, so the Castro Valley Gilmores. He would come over here when he wasn't traveling about every other week, do some handyman jobs, catch up with us, and get a good meal, which helped. And then he also was very involved with the Castro Valley Gilmores. He would go down there about every other week when he wasn't traveling, do handyman work, he got into that, and then he would tutor their children. So the 4 out of the 5, the 5th is too young at this point to get tutored. He would tutor all those kids. It was a continuing process. It was just great. And so you could see on the tape, he also gave them haircuts, which they didn't necessarily appreciate. They kind of liked tutoring. Haircuts weren't big for them. So unfortunately, what happened is late last year, he started picking up illnesses related probably to long COVID, and that did him in. So he ultimately died in September. He was born in December of 46, so he died at 77. Yeah. So that was really sad. So at that point, we just wanted to celebrate him and thank you for coming. And again, who we need to really thank for setting this up is Ellen and Mary Davidsky.
My name is Rob, and I work with Bruce at OGC HHS in San Francisco. And I've been asked to read something from one of our colleagues there who couldn't make it today. It's a nice offering. He's known in part as the author of the historical biography of Lola Montez, who was an actress, dancer, courtesan, and mistress of Ludwig I, King of Bavaria. She also lived for a while in San Francisco. Many years later, in September of 2023, there was a dedication ceremony and celebration of the renaming of the 600 block of Commercial Street between Kearny and Montgomery Streets in the financial district to Emperor Norton Place. Colorful figures from San Francisco history were there for the event, including the emperor himself dressed in full regalia with medals and feathers, as well as a mysterious person dressed as Lola Montez and represented by a modern impersonator. At the end of the ceremony, Countess Montez sang, "I left my heart in San Francisco." I had wanted to ask Bruce if he thought it was an accurate representation of Lola Montez at this event, and if, by any chance, he may have fooled everyone there by attending the ceremony and dressing as King Ludwig's muse himself. But I forgot to ask him these intriguing questions. In the years that I knew Bruce, I do not ever remember him singing. So it seems unlikely he was the one there who warbled, "I left my heart in San Francisco." But I'll never know for sure, and he's not telling. May God love you, Bruce. You have left a large hole in our lives that can never be filled. Harry McDonough. Very lovely gesture. One thing that, unlike with Harry, one thing that Bruce often shared with me was his singing. He would sing when we would get in the car, and I'd ask him, bringing up the Jeopardy thing again, if he had been invited to go back and do Jeopardy after Super Jeopardy, but he said no because he had stopped pretty much following popular culture after 1970. And so one of the things he would sing in the car were all these 60s hits, right, which were, I'm a little younger than Bruce, that would kind of go over my head, right, like Petula Clark and a few others, right, he would sing these songs. And so, but reading Harry's thing made me think about that Bruce, had all of us in his life, and he shared certain things with us, a book club with some of you, the Air Force with Tom, different parts of his life that made up Bruce. And so it was surreal because one of the things I didn't share was you all, like directly, like I had met you people, and yet I know so much about you from through Bruce, right? It was so like bizarre. I didn't know whether to be insulted. Are you embarrassed? Like you don't want to share me with your friends, right? And then I started to learn like that. No, that's how he was with a lot of people. And so it's really fascinating how this man operated, right? But so when I showed up today and I started meeting some of you, and I thought like, wow, this is Bruce's life story here. I'm seeing it in real time, meeting you some. It's just remarkable. Anyway, this morning as I was getting ready to come over here, my daughter lives close by. I live in Los Angeles. I'm staying with one of my daughters in Walnut Creek. And she was trying to cheer me up because she knew I was sad about all this. And she reminded me, Bruce, Dad, lived a whole life. Like he really stretched and squeezed everything you could out of life. I mean, he really was his own man, so unique. And that is a word that perfectly describes Bruce. He was so unique. He was so different. I've never known anyone in my life like Bruce. I know you hear those kinds of comments at other memorials that you may go to, but it's never been more true than with Bruce. He was so different, so unique. And I'm so lucky, so blessed, as I'm sure you all are, to have had Bruce in your lives. And so my daughter was right, that he had he was a perfect avatar for what we should aspire, and that is to squeeze everything you can out of life while you still have it. And I really appreciate him for that, but I definitely miss him. Some of the things I don't miss are the weird eating habits, the going to, like going by restaurants and seeing food that the restaurants would leave out for the homeless, and I guess for Bruce too, and he'd pick up your food, and I go, Bruce, I'll get you something in the restaurant. It's like, why? It's right here, And, anyway, just so unique. By the way, he always described to me food as a bodily function, right? That was just a bodily function, Rob. Why are you spending so much money at a restaurant, Rob?
No, he never went into a restaurant. He
did not like
He only got
restaurants.
forced into a restaurant occasionally, but he had total aversion to going to a restaurant.
Exactly, yeah.
On his desk.
What's that?
His desk-
Yeah.
Oh my God, his office.
I've seen the pictures.
His
No,
office
I've seen the
was
pictures.
unreal, right? In fact, I was talking to Pam and to Mary earlier about that, right? She said, hey, how did your bosses look at it? I go, like he was crazy, right? Like, who is this guy, right? And they would ask him to tone it down, right? And he would tone it down for a little bit, and within a few weeks, it was back up like the way you see it in that picture, right? It was crazy. It really was.
Of a busy brain.
It is, yeah, exactly.
Toys.
The toys, oh my God, we would go to, he would go to 99-cent stores, and we would take our lunch together. And he would come back with all these stuffed animals, that were 99 cents, and he would put them up. And so when he left the federal government, when he retired, and I was still there, I took some of those things that he had in his office and hung them up in my own home. I know, I never thought I'd be that guy, but there I was. Bruce had turned me into that guy. But it was such an honor to have known someone like Bruce, so unique. One other funny story, he was a talker, as many, if not all of you know, and so much so that he would spend so much time in my office. I'm a lawyer, by the way, and he would spend, hours in my office, and it got to the point where our bosses had to move his office away from mine, and like hoping that was gonna, no, Bruce would still find his way over. You couldn't keep him down. I mean, there's no doing that to Bruce. And with other employees, I think they maybe even would have been disciplined, but you couldn't do that to someone like Bruce, right? He was so singular, so different than anyone I've ever known. At work, outside of work, in the messages he would send you, the experiences you would experience with him, just so singular. I, like all of you, I'm going to miss him terribly, do already. There's not a day that goes by that I don't think about Bruce. But I'm so glad, I mentioned this to someone earlier too, that when I walked in the door and I started seeing some of these faces, the names to whom I'd known for so long, I kind of felt like his heart had opened up, and I was starting to see who, was special to him and who made up his heart. And so I feel like I'm in such a revered company, and so I'm really happy to be here, and we love you, Bruce.
I have been asked to read a piece that came from his friend Prue Lampert. So here's what Prue has to say. I first met Bruce during my travels in South America in my 20s. It was 1976, that gap year that, one of many gap years that Bruce mentioned. We were in Chile, on Chihole Island, a windswept place with a lot of sheep and grass. We traveled on a boat from Puerto Montt down to Tierra del Fuego, and everyone got violently sick in the stormy waves of the Golfo de Piñas. Bruce cheered up the passengers with his enthusiastic singing of opera. There it is.
That's how they got it.
He returned to this area recently and found it completely changed by both tourism, cruise ships in Ushuaia, a former fishing village, and climate change. Many huge glaciers melted. I continued my South America travels and work and ended up sleeping on Bruce's floor in San Francisco in 1978. He lent me his bike to explore around. I remember his kitchen contained a lot of cookies. We called them biscuits, and a hammer and chisel sat on the top of the fridge to be used to hack off frozen turkey meat from a large block. He seemed to live on that, and I did too when visiting. Bruce came to Mali when I was working there in the early 80s. He stayed at my house, but I was away at the time. He went into the bush on a push bike without enough water and almost expired of thirst. He was on his last legs near a village when a woman gave him a full calabash of water, in which he reported seeing wiggly creatures, but he put the lot down his neck anyhow. In the early 1990s, it was Bruce's turn to sleep on our floor in London as he spent his days at the British Library researching Lola Montez. By then, I had two small sons who couldn't understand why Brucey went to the library all the time. I've read parts of Bruce's wonderful tome, and now I'll read it all. My ex-husband's family live in Rome, and we met up there several times as Bruce was always eager to pursue the history and culture. Same in London in subsequent years, where he got to know the museums and galleries better than anyone. Bruce was a great letter writer. The letters became long emails, and he reported in amusing details his travels, impressions, and adventures. Travel was his passion in life, and he managed to pursue it until the end. He wrote to me in April 2024 about Antarctica, which would be his last great trip. He always remembered my birthday. I remember having my 50th with him when I was on a work trip in Hanoi, where Bruce happened to be at the time. Of course. Bruce would also send me a wall calendar, usually with photos of San Francisco, without fail every November. There is now a blank space on my kitchen wall where the calendar always hung. Regrettably, I cannot be with you, but I hope the above can be added to the many stories that I expect will be told about Bruce's life and friendships today. Warm regards to all, Prudence Lampert, or Woozy, as Bruce always called me.
Lola traveled farther than most women of her time, and Bruce followed her path closely. He was the first to dispel some of the myths and shadows she cast over her own life. Among many other important discoveries, he uncovered and published her real birth date, so we know when she was born because of Bruce. He was, without question, the world's foremost expert on Lola Montez. I encountered him through his book and later through the wealth of Lola material he generously published online, a gift to all future Lola researchers. That in itself was extraordinary. Most scholars tend to guard their discoveries, but Bruce shared his freely. He believed in participation, in open exchange, in generosity. Not only as a researcher, but as a generous, open-minded man he was. His work was a great help to me in writing my own biography of Lola Montez as well. And we actually talked about that quite a bit in our little book group. That started our conversation, which at first focused mostly on Lola. He did not get access to the diaries of King Ludwig, whereas I had the privilege to work with them. We compared findings, shared our insights. He once admitted that he had nearly abandoned Lola when he learned how she had treated the loving king. Bruce was a man of principle, and he sympathized with the deceived and exploited Ludwig, even if it meant viewing Lola more critically. Bruce and I continued to follow her traces in digital conversations. I believe he was happy to have found someone to speak with about her again. A German reviewer of Bruce's book ended his article with a line, "Once again, she has an admirer." That could not have been more true. In August 2022, Bruce came to visit us in Munich. Another theme we seem to get here. Together, we retraced Lola and Ludwig's love story. We visited the royal residence. We stood in front of Lola's famous portrait in Ludwig's Schoening Gallery, the Gallery of Beauties at Nymphenburg Castle, thus following her footsteps in Munich once again. Bruce was also deeply interested in my new project, a biography of Ludwig, and had planned to return in the summer of 24 to discuss it further with me. With Bruce, I lost more than just an academic correspondent. I lost a friend. I cherished his long emails, his gift of storytelling, the way he spoke about himself with wit, irony, and self-awareness. I loved his thoughtful way of discussing things, his openness to new ideas and to all subjects, his curiosity about everything. And I miss him. And so do we.
In 1980, so this is Anna speaking. In 1984, my friend Karl-Heinz Tuch and I, Anna Tuch, were still students, full of dreams and a thirst for adventure. In the summer, we hitchhiked to sunny Bulgaria on the Black Sea. After days of traveling, a gray VW Passat station wagon pulled up next to us one afternoon. A young man, who we would later get to know as Bruce Seymour, spoke to us in almost accent-free German. He asked if we would like to drive on with him. We didn't have to think twice, of course, we got in. Bruce was American and on a trip around the world. We quickly struck up a conversation during the journey. We were amazed by his impressive language skills. In addition to German, he spoke fluent Spanish and French, knew a little Italian, and had an extraordinary knowledge of the countries he had already traveled to and those that were still on his list. As citizens of the GDR, we only had limited opportunities to explore Europe. Our travels mostly took us to the Eastern Bloc countries. So we admired the freedom and openness that Bruce radiated. It was exciting to hear about his experiences and learn how different our worlds were. But despite his language skills, there was one small problem. In Bulgaria, people write in Cyrillic? Cyrillic characters, and these were completely foreign to Bruce. Not all street signs had an addition in Latin script, which made orientation difficult. As we had Russian lessons at school, we had a slight advantage. This quickly turned out to be an amusing challenge, and we often had to laugh and had a good time together. So we drove for 3 days toward the Black Sea. At the end of our trip, we invited Bruce to visit East Germany, and he actually kept his word. This meeting with Bruce Seymour in the summer of 1984 was the beginning of a friendship that was very intense over the years and incredibly enriching for our whole family. Anna Greet, Nieder, I never could say that.
Hi everyone, I'm Brian. I'm Uncle Bruce's pseudo-nephew. I have another memory to share from two of Uncle Bruce's German friends named Volker and Olivia. All right, so the memory starts. We, Volker and Olivia, met Bruce through our friends Anne and Karl Heinz in 1990. We admired him for his vast knowledge. We called him a walking encyclopedia, which is true. His determination, his perseverance, for example, his long bike tours and intense studies in the libraries. And we also, of course, appreciated his sense of humor. Over the years, we had several reunions with Bruce. In 2007, we visited the Western U.S. and also San Francisco, and had the privilege of staying for a few days in the house of Ellen and her husband Bruce, this house right here, and in the children's room. Thank you again for that, which is part of the story I don't remember, but apparently they stayed in our room. And Uncle Bruce, in quotes, because of course he was just Bruce to them, but he was Uncle Bruce to us, showed us around the city. The last time we saw Bruce was in the summer of 2023 when he visited us here in the outskirts of Berlin, and we were very happy about it. We had no idea this would be our last meeting. There are many beautiful and also funny episodes of Bruce, so we'll share two of them here. So we've got two stories from Volker and Olivia here. The first story is called The American Best Man. And this story is Olivia's first encounter with Bruce happened when Bruce and I were both best men at Anne and Karl Heinz's wedding. Or best men and best woman, I believe that's what it says. At the registry office in Mulhausen, just before the wedding, it had to be clarified whether Bruce could be a best man in Germany, and it turns out that yes, he could. And Uncle Bruce is, of course, fluent in German, so I don't know why he perhaps couldn't have been a best man in Germany, but maybe there's some citizenry rules and German marriages. The second story is called Love Triangle, and with the subtitle Uncle Bruce Ice Cream. So this one takes place in the summer of 2003 when Bruce stayed with us in Berlin for several weeks. At that time, Bruce was researching National Socialism in Germany before and during World War II, and spent a lot of time in the archives of the Topography of Terror Memorial in Berlin. So a light topic. During this time, we went on vacation, and Bruce took care of the apartment, the tomato plants in the balcony, and the fish in the aquarium. Someone knows where this is going? All right. Any predictions?
It was definitely a favor for him to do that.
Okay.
Something he would do ordinarily.
Here's how it turns out. The summer was very hot, so Bruce bought a large fan, which we still use today, but unfortunately, this is where it turns. Unfortunately, while we were away, 3 fish in the aquarium seemed to have passed away. Upon our return, Bruce explained the situation as follows. It turns out there was a love triangle between the 3 fish. Fish 1 was in love with fish 2. However, fish 2 had already formed a steady bond with fish 3, and the passionate fish 1 could not bear this, and thus killed fish 2. And then fish 1 killed itself. There's a note here that the loss in the aquarium wasn't a problem for me. So the subtitle is Uncle Bruce Ice Cream. And he said, to welcome us back, and possibly to compensate for this situation, Bruce served us his ice cream creation of Uncle Bruce ice cream, which I have to admit, I never got Uncle Bruce ice cream. I was never served. I don't even remember this ice cream, but he was famous for liking strange ice cream. There's a Goo Goo Cluster in memory on that table, which is probably similar to this. His mixture consists of vanilla, plum jam, salted peanuts, and it was delicious. When I was thinking of the things that I like to remember most about Uncle Bruce, it kept coming back to me the things he disliked. I know we talked about the things that he did like. So I've just made a short list of kind of odd things that Uncle Bruce didn't like that kind of put him in better perspective. And some of them we've talked about already. But Uncle Bruce was not interested at all in sports. Of every man I've ever known, he didn't like talking about sports at all. He didn't like watching sports. He didn't like playing sports. About the only time he ever would talk about anything sports was when he talked about the Arminia Bielefeld team, which he would usually complain about them being relegated or something like that. But he was not a sportsman. He also did not ever wear hats or sunscreen, which I don't understand because I burn all the time, and he would walk around in the sun all day and never get burned and never wear a hat or any sunscreen. He didn't like nice clothes. We talked about that. That's probably about as dressed up as he's ever been in the corner right there. Usually what he'd wear, at least when I saw him, would be like some joke gift someone got him 7 years ago and was meant as a throwaway, but he was still wearing it. He didn't like spending money. I think he just wasn't a material person, and he didn't think anything was worth his money, and nothing excited him that was new or expensive. But of course, he did spend his money on travel, but he did that in the most frugal way possible. He did not spend money on real haircuts also. He did his own haircut. That's his classic look there. And he would sort of like maintain it like once a week, like just trim around the sides, and it would always look exactly the same because he was always doing his own haircut. He didn't like fancy food, or it wasn't so much they didn't like it, he just didn't seek it out. He just would eat whatever was in front of him, and he was perfect for eating all the leftovers for us as a kid, because he would wolf down everything in front of him, but he would never seek it out. And toward the end of his life, he got it really into borscht, and I think that was like his main meal all the time was borscht, which I've never actually had. Of course, he didn't like regular work. After Super Jeopardy, I think he spent, 2 or 3 decades before he went back to work with Rob at the HHS. And I think mostly that was because he wanted to pursue his own interests, and work, of course, gets in the way of that. He didn't like cars. Uncle Bruce went many years without ever getting behind the wheel. And he didn't even like riding in cars as a passenger, really. He would like to walk everywhere. If he wasn't walking, a bike, or take the subway, or take the bus. On the political front, he definitely did not like Donald Trump, and that was in Trump 1.0. If he was here today, he would probably be talking about it right now in Trump 2.0. And he hated jury duty. I never really understood why, but he hated jury duty so much that he went years and years without being registered to vote just so he could get out of doing jury duty. It's not like he had a shortage of time, or he was a lawyer. It seems like something I'm being interested, but he really despised those jury duty notices. Normal sleep schedules. He was pretty close to nocturnal when I was a kid, and there's some famous stories of him, missing pickup time at like 1 in the afternoon down in Havens down the street because he was still sleeping. When he went back to work at HHS, he probably adjusted a little bit, but he was still very much a night owl. He hated being even the tiniest bit in his mind overweight. So he was always very thin, like that picture right there. But like he'd go on a trip and he'd come back and he'd weigh himself constantly and take his blood pressure too. So he's taking his blood pressure. But he'd weigh himself and he'd tell you about it for the next week or so. I'm a couple pounds overweight. I shouldn't be eating this stuff, and on and on. And he always looked perfectly thin to me. Minor grammar failures was one of his pet peeves. He would like seek out errors in the New York Times or something like that, or in the news media. One funny one that he got fixated on one time was the pronunciation of the phrase bully pulpit and where to put the emphasis on which syllable, and we went back and forth in that for weeks. Another one was lay versus lie. I guess other people know. He was a talker, so there's a lot of things to talk about. That was one of the things that if someone got it wrong, and I don't know which one is right even today, but I would half listen to it. He didn't like being called a nanny. Famously in his Super Jeopardy video, he called himself a Billy. But he never really called himself any of those things. He just didn't like that reference. Then he didn't like sitting down at movie theaters or operas. He just thought a warm, cold, dark room was a place to sleep, and so couldn't really get him to go to movies very often. We had a tradition of going on Christmas Eve, and he'd sometimes fall asleep on that. But at the opera, he'd always try and be a docent so he could stand up. And then, of course, he didn't like going to class, which we all covered in great detail. There were a number of things he did like, and we talked about most of them already. Just a couple ones that we didn't touch on so far. The Christmas lights on the house was a spectacle throughout all of Piedmont, and so he would risk his life going up on the roof and putting up so many lights so you could see him probably from across the bay over there. And last week was Easter, and I was remembering how skilled he was at hiding Easter eggs, that we'd be finding them around Christmas time. And Emily and I weren't able to find them during the course of the year. And we took that as a challenge to see how long it would take for us to find the Easter eggs each year. He loved digitizing old pictures and videos, so a lot of the ones that we were looking at just today, he had digitized for us with some software he got. So many different languages, English and German, of course, but he was very good at French and Spanish, and then he was constantly learning new languages, and he wouldn't really get to the point where he got fluent because he'd get bored and start learning a new language, but he's doing Russian and then Japanese and so many different languages that he knew at least a little bit of. And then travel, which is the number one thing that I think was Uncle Bruce's passion, his sort of spirit for exploration and curiosity and just insatiable interest in what was going on in the world. So I just wanted to end with a quick quote, which is from a book I read in college, which is one of the only times I ever read anything about a person where I thought maybe that is like one little glint of what reminds me of Uncle Bruce, because he is such an unconventional person that there's almost nothing you can think of that reminds me of him. But I think this quote does a decent job of representing sort of his philosophy on life. So this is from a book called Into the Wild. Some of you might have read it or seen the movie. It's about 3 sentences. It says, "So many people live within unhappy circumstances and yet will not take the initiative to change their situation because they are conditioned to a life of security, conformity, and conservatism, all of which may appear to give one peace of mind, but in reality, nothing is more damaging to the adventurous spirit within a man than a secure future. The very basic core of a man's living spirit is his passion for adventure. The joy of life comes from our encounters with new experiences, and hence there's no greater joy than to have an endlessly changing horizon, and for each day to have a new and different sun." And so I think that represents Uncle Bruce's idea of enjoying the world and sharing it with all of us. So, thank you.
Friendship for many years, since 1968. We met in the military. Immediately recognized we had the same birthday, and he's the only person I ever met that had the same birthday as me, so that was pretty special. But being in the military with Bruce was probably beyond anything any of you here could comprehend. And you're right. But so was
the Air
I.
Force after all.
I was a captain. It was my last year, and I was up in Montana, just doing my last year before I came back to Sacramento. And Bruce had, ironically, done the Navigator Training School at the Major Air Force Base in Sacramento. And he did 11 months out of 12 months, and then decided there were pictures of people being shot down over Vietnam and not recovered. And probably being in an airplane was not the place to be. So he did what was called an SIE, which was a self-eliminated, whatever.
Self-initiated elimination.
Good.
I've heard it from Bruce.
Yeah. Which carried a certain stigma with it, particularly when the Air Force had invested 11 months teaching you very complicated stuff. And so he, as he described it, his commander recommended that he be sent as close to the BMU's line as possible. It's punishment. I don't know how many of you remember what the BMU's line was, but it's way up north. And so he was. They said to Great Falls, that was as good as they could come up with. And I met him, ironically, in a snowstorm. walking down the street in his big Air Force coat and headed to the same office I was going. Well, it turns out he was a supply officer and I was a supply officer, but he only had 1 year under his belt. And I had 3, waiting to get to the 4th done. And I was about as military as he was, I thought, but after I got to know him better, I realized nobody is as unmilitary as Bruce is. And I can highlight that with one of the incidents that always, he would come to my office, all the other stories of what do you do to fill a day, you know, particularly something you don't like. And he would just kind of wander around the base, and he worked in for the maintenance people, and were kind of expected to fix aircraft now and then. And one of his commanders was heard to say, "Damn it, Seymour, when are they going to get rid of you and send me a real officer?" And so I always kidded Bruce that, you know, the fact that I saved his life in that snowstorm meant we were bonded for life. And we pretty much were. And we had a lot of good times. My wife and I lived off base, and we would have him over as often as possible, and he just became part of the family, just like he did in so many of your families. And we had so many good times. And I'll try to clean up some of them, see. Well, I think my main claim to fame with Bruce is I was able to fix him up with 3 different women. And you know, I always thought, no, this is the one, this is the one. And somehow it never worked out that way. But I remember one in particular who was a friend of mine, and she was a very bright woman. And I wasn't sure, but he really talked to her. And he actually said to me one day, you know, if I was gonna get married, I'd marry her. Well, that was heavy duty, but then I realized the real Bruce would always be there. And sure enough, they were getting really hot and heavy together, and he decided he had to take the tour of the president's graves. All 50 of them, and he did. And then when he was talking to me, and he said, I just don't understand what happened. I said, Bruce, you left her to go to all 50 of the president's graves. What do you think she was going to do? He was just kind of dumbfounded by that. He didn't seem to know that probably wasn't well liked. And then let's see, there was another one who, probably the only person I ever knew that probably had an intellect close to Bruce's, probably not as close, and she was an interesting person. And she got very involved with her. Then she found out he wasn't going to make a lot of money. You know, she fell in love with a lawyer, and he wasn't really a lawyer, right? Unless he had to be. So that didn't last too long, but she was, that was an interesting period too. And then you had another one, and you know, they all liked him and they were all interesting, but time to move on, you know. And I realized over time, what really matters to Bruce is travel. And nothing else matters as much as travel. And those women were a big part of his life, and they were pretty good periods, if I say so myself, but not good enough. And that was just Bruce. So I accepted that, and we spent many a time. My favorite bar is the Buena Vista in San Francisco. I like Irish coffees for some reason. And so we would always meet at the Buena Vista, and Bruce hated it. He hated it. And it wasn't, you know, he wasn't a big drinker, but he'd always have a couple with me, and then we'd go take a walk, we always call it. We'd take a walk somewhere around San Francisco, and he would tell me about the history of the Bank of America building and, you know, every building in town. And, but he tolerated it up until the last time I saw him. He still tolerated it. But it wasn't a good fit. So we had many happy hours there. I think we celebrated probably 10 or 15 birthdays together. That was our place. And finally, the last time I saw him, I think maybe in November, I said, you know, Bruce, why don't you like to sit here? We're just going to be here for a while. And he said, oh no, you can't hear me here. Meaning, you know, I want to talk about this, and we never had a dull moment. And but for those of you that say you'd be less if you hadn't known Bruce, I've never known a more interesting person. He is the most fascinating, intelligent, and what other adjectives would you use, Jim? Unusual.
Self-direct.
Self-directed, yeah. Not self-obsessed, self-directed.
No, definitely not.
Okay, good. Yeah, so I really miss Bruce, and I was telling Dorothy on the way over. Bruce was my excuse to come to San Francisco every month, and I was over here just about every month, do our usual thing. And now I don't have him.
You should mention how he enjoyed visiting your place up at Sea Ranch too.
Yeah, but he didn't go up much. It was a funny thing. He went up
No, he grew up there when you did invite him.
in the early years. Yeah, he was always busy. But I just thank you, Bruce, for letting me get to know you. We were probably close friends for that whole time, up until now. And the Gilmores, thank you guys. I think if you hadn't raised him right, he would he would have never made it.
I don't think I wanted him as my role model.
I know. I used to talk about his garret. That was his garret, downstairs there. And I always got a kick out, and he was very proud of it. It was, it was the absolute perfect place for him to live. It had room for lots of books.
Right.
And that's all he needed.
8,000 books.
8,000.
I mean, he had a list of them all. It wasn't kind of like a guess.
No, of
He had
course.
8,000 books.
Yeah. Proceeded to take his wheel hat, which is the round hat, and roll up his pant legs and climb on the desk and dance. And I thought, oh shit, my boss is gonna walk in any minute. How will I explain this? But he had his uniform on, so that was his problem. But anyway, I could go on and on, but I won't. Thank you.
I really only experienced one facet of the man, and he had hundreds of facets, for heaven's sake. We never discussed our personal lives, and we discussed Lola. And as I told some of you, that was how we connected. I had already been interested in Lola for 20 years when his book came out, and I'd read other books, and it was a little hard to sort out what was truth in those. There were the usual points of nonsense and mythologizing, and so it was suddenly a breath of fresh air. A friend sent me his book. Said, all right, let's see which version of the usual stuff this is, and it wasn't. It was the real stuff. And so I wrote to him in care of the publisher, and we made our connection and continued connecting over the decades and sharing discoveries and thoughts. And we met at the Bancroft sometimes, where he had all his research materials on deposit after he had done with them, and he made them available to anyone else. And so that was before they did the remodeling at the Bancroft, and things were kind of loose, but they knew me there, so they didn't really notice if I was taking photos and documents out of the folders and putting them on my clipboard and quietly retiring to the ladies' room and taking pictures of it. That was before, people had cell phones with cameras, and they'd say, yeah, go ahead, take pictures. Just don't share them. In fact, this was back in the days of film. And the thing is, the Bancroft was so expensive to get things duplicated and get a nice print, and so there were some things I actually smuggled out and got duplicated or ran on my copier. And Bruce said he didn't mind, and he had no control over that material once he had turned it over to them. And I even went in with my K1000 Pentax, body strapped to one thigh and the lens strapped to the other under my skirt, went into the ladies' room and shot pictures of the photo prints. Oh, those were the days. I was still refining my research technique, but he was so generous with his findings. Early on, let's see, he gave me a floppy disk with his Lola chronology, and the thing wasn't really working. And so he printed out this enormous binder full of the stuff for me, just like that. And sort of on it went with that. And then when I had acquired on eBay a copy of the Grima autobiography of Lola, this was such a rare book. It was held by, 2 or 3 institutions in the whole world. And here was a copy of it. And the thing is, people didn't know what it was. So I got it very cheaply. And he had already, let's see, he already had a Xeroxed copy of it, but to have a real one was quite a find. And then the thing was, I was always a little low on funds, and so I kind of needed to liquidate it, so he bought it from me and let me make a profit so he could deposit it at the Bancroft with his other materials, and they could have the prestige of being one of the few institutions that held that book. Of course, this was all in German black letter, which he could read. And when I was always trying to locate every stage or film portrayal of Lola, and there was a silent film called, rather ridiculously, Palace of Pleasure, which, I mean, this sounds like a high-class bordello, but it was made, let's see, this was, when was that, 26, 27, anyway. I found the book upon which it was based, which was in German, and it was all in the black letter, which is impenetrable to most people nowadays. But he sat up the whole night translating the darn thing so that I could have it, and it was one of those heroic tasks. At least it wasn't a terrifically long book, but that's the sort of thing he would do, of course. And so it's just really hard to not have him in the world. But we're grateful for what we had of him, and I had no idea about most of his life, but I had a little piece of it, and that was a very fine piece. So anyway, I will, my eventual Lola book, Who's Got the Countess, it's called, Lola Montez as Subject and Source of Misinformation, celebrating the usual nonsense and some really outrageous falsehoods that have been published about her over the years. Anyway, I'd certainly dedicate that to him. For that was, well, he would sometimes sign his emails with yours in the Lola Bond.